Class, welcome back. Week 14, Nanook of the North, made by a filmmaker named Robert Flaherty, 1922. Black and white, silent film. Okay? First documentary of the semester. We haven't watched any documentaries. This is our first one. And this is the first commercially successful feature-length documentary film in North America, which happened in 1922. Before we get into the film, let's talk about documentary and let's work out a definition of documentary, okay? On that first slide down there, it says, documentary of social reality versus wish fulfillment. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put this information in your hands. You could think on this for a month. Like, what's the difference between a fiction film and a documentary film? It's a much harder question than it appears. I can make a film, I can put an actor in fake Roman armor and on a horse, and I might get a bunch of shots of him, and I might use those shots in a documentary for the Discovery Channel about ancient Rome. I might use the exact same shots in a fiction film about, it's also set in Rome, but it's just something I made up. So the images themselves don't determine whether or not it's what we call documentary or fiction. It's something else, it's deeper. So here are the tools. In our language, we say fiction, film, documentary, and we pretend that there's like a wall between them. Step one is take the wall down. There is not a perfect division between them, and they bleed across, and they speak, and they interact with each other. The better language, if you want to really sort of get a handle on this, the better language would be on one side you would say films of wish fulfillment and films of social reality. Okay, here's what I mean by this. You can go to a movie theater, say it's Star Wars, right? When you walk into the theater to watch a Star Wars film, you're going to engage in this narrative as a wish fulfillment. In other words, there's an agreement between you and the film. You know it's not real. It's not pretending to be real, but it's going to give you an experience that's pleasing and exciting probably, and you engage it that way. You agree, yeah, I'll go along with it. I know it's not real, but I'm going to go along with it. I want the wish fulfillment. I want the dream. I want the entertainment. Other films, what we usually call documentaries, the agreement is that the film is going to reflect to you something with social reality, something that's showing you life as it actually is, that isn't created but that actually exists. And those are the sort of implicit agreements of the two sides, what we call fiction and documentary, but they do bleed across. So this is a film about social reality, Nanook of the North. Now this film is made by Robert Flaherty. 1922, he was working in northeastern Canada. He got exposed to this environment, this atmosphere, was very interested in it. Went back to the States, got some film equipment. He was basically self-taught. Went back to northeastern Canada, shot a film, came back to the United States, started trying to put it together, was failing, accidentally set all the negatives on fire, and the film got destroyed. Spent years raising more money, went back to Canada, and finally shot the film that you're going to watch. So this is early filmmaking. These are they're awesome tools, but they're simple. No sound, just pictures. And the story is primarily about this one, what we would call an Eskimo, which is not quite accurate, but that's the idea, to show sort of a traditional people in northeastern Alaska. Now this would be also like sort of using exotic people as a form of entertainment, so let's not pretend that that's not true. A couple details. First of all, Nanook of the North is not an Eskimo. Eskimos are just one of many, many tribes that live in the northern Americas. He might be a Tlingit or Haida, I'm not sure, but he's not an Eskimo. Second, his real name is not Nanook. Third, the woman you see in the film who appears to be his wife is not his real wife. That was the filmmaker putting someone in there for the scenes. In the film, you'll see Nanook using very traditional implements for hunting, spears and knives and stuff like that. The real man used a rifle to hunt at this time, right? So why is he only hunting with spears and stuff like that? Well, the filmmaker wanted to tell a certain type of story, right? Now you're starting to see the ethical challenge of making a documentary. Some more information. The man who is Nanook in the film died a couple years after the film was finished, and the story has always been that he died of starvation, which if you watch the film is a very compelling narrative because a lot of the film was about him catching food. I don't think anybody really knows how he died, and it's just as likely that he died from TB as it was from starvation. Starvation is sounds like kind of little something to give the film a boost. So Flaherty was manipulating a lot of reality in order to deliver the story. And this is the fundamental dilemma of documentary filmmaking, is that on one hand, a documentary demands social reality, something that's truthful. You can't lie. Simultaneously, the audience needs the filmmaker to craft the reality into narrative form, and it works better if it's entertaining. And so Flaherty is changing things and adjusting things, trying to negotiate that. Now, you'll see that there's a quote in the middle of the top slide again. It says, filmmakers must often distort things to catch its true spirit. So this suggests his personal ethos, his personal point of view on this challenge between sticking to reality as it exactly was and giving people sort of an experience, right? Now, if you wonder, well, if you say, well, no, I think that documentaries have to be absolutely true. And think about that for a second. What that means is basically watching like a security camera video. Just laying an edit, just cutting time out, you're already manipulating reality, right? So it is incumbent on the filmmaker to make substantial changes and adjustments. But simultaneously, how do you maintain the ethics and the truth of the film? And this is something it's an eternal battle. Okay. It's a fun film to watch. It's fairly short, so you should enjoy this film. We're gonna watch another silent film next week. That is it's the most amazing film I think I may have ever seen. Next week, I love this one too, though. A few things about the silent era of film. Just a couple facts, okay? The silent era goes through. It's going strong. It's dominant through the late 1920s. Okay, place that in your mind. 1920s in America, Roaring 20s. The Great Depression hasn't started yet. World War I is over. We're in that period of American history, the lost generation. You've got Hemingway, you've got all kinds of famous artists in Paris. This is that moment right there. 27 is when the first talkie happens. The first talkie, by which I mean film with sync sound. In other words, when the characters open their mouths and talk, the sound matches. It's not a silent film anymore. 1927, the film is called The Jazz Singer. Now, you've got to place yourself. For a contemporary audience, this is hard, because it looks so old to us. It looks so corny to us. But just take yourself back. You're a kid. Let's say you live in rural, outside Fresno, California, okay? Your parents are farmers. Your world, what does it sound like? There's a radio in your living room, if you're lucky. You hear your animals in the backyard. You probably got pigs and cows and chickens, right? You have a car. It might be a 4-cylinder or 6-cylinder, and there's a train that goes by every night. That's the sound of your world, right? Once a month, you might get to go to a movie house and watch a movie. Maybe once a year, maybe never. But either way, when you walk in that room, the room is dark. There's a giant screen in front of you. Now imagine the contrast from regular life to this. And suddenly enormous pictures form on the screen that look absolutely photorealistic, right? It must have been extraordinary. Now add in, for the first time ever, that when one of those giant faces open their mouth, the sounds that come out match perfectly the movement of their lips, right? This was a profound step forward in the technology. It was very difficult to do, though. One of the problems of early talkie films, of sync sound films, was that the mic had to be placed very near the actor. So if you look at silent films before the talkie, the visual development of silent film, I mean, when we watch Chaplin next week, the movement, the blocking is just beautiful. When talkies start, all of a sudden the actors have to be stuck in one spot because they have to be close to the mic. And suddenly you see this sort of stiffness, right? And the scenes look frozen and theatrical, like they can't move as much. So it was not a perfectly smooth transition. It took Hollywood a long time to figure out how to do a talkie where the movement of the scene could continue. It didn't just get stuck in the mud, right? Okay. Take yourself back and try to imagine you're that kid. You know, you're 12, you live on a farm in rural America, and you walk into a theater, and this is the first time you ever see a big moving image with sound happen at the same time. Here's a little bit from The Jazz Singer 1927. Check it out.
wonderful pals are always hard to find. Some folks have one, some folks have none. And I was alone for years, but fate was kind. And in the end, sent me a friend. Although he's not much higher than my knee, still he's the greatest thing on earth to me. Dirty hands, dirty face, leads the neighbors a chase, but his smile is as cute as can be. Making noise, breaking toys, always fighting the boys, but his eyes, they're a vision to see. And when my work is done, coming home to the setting sun, from the gate he'll start to run, and then I'll kiss my boy.
Okay, so one of the other innovations of the silent period is something called an intertitle. It's very simple. An intertitle looks like this. And these were developed just as a tool for exposition, for explaining, exposition, to explain to the audience what was happening or what had just happened before there was sound, right? Because you can imagine there's some things you can't tell visually. It just works better if you write it. So intertitles were really, really important for silent films. Okay, let's shift gears. We're going to talk about frame rates for a second. Frame rates, this is a technical conversation. It's based on camera technology. To start off, first thing, frame rate describes the number of pictures taken per second. Now, first of all, this is a motion picture camera called a Bolex. These are made in Switzerland. They're very common. You can buy these on eBay. And on the side here, I have a selection. This is my frame rate selection. And I can choose a number of different frame rates. All this means is how many pictures per second is the camera going to capture per second. So the standard for motion picture film, you have to know this. This is something you have to memorize. The standard for motion picture film is 24 frames per second. 24 pictures per second are taken for classic Hollywood film. Okay? Here's what that sounds like. Here's 24 frames per second. Okay, the standard for video, and by video I mean the standards that were set back in the 80s to carry on right up to now. This is usually what you watch on television. If you're watching a football game, you're watching local news. That system works at 30 frames per second. In other words, there's more pictures per second being captured for what we call video. Here's what that sounds like. So it's, it's about 20% faster, 20% more frames per second. And the two end up looking different. So standard for film, motion picture film, is 24 frames per second. Standard for video is 30 frames per second. You gotta know that. That's on the quiz. Okay, now when modern audiences watch old black and white films, it's very common you'll see a film. It could be Chaplin, it could be Buster Keaton, and you'll see that the motion is either accelerated or it's slow. The motion just doesn't look right. Sometimes it was used for comedic effects, like Keystone Cops. But a lot of times it's not supposed to look like that. And it's an accident in translation of technology. In other words, the camera was shooting, say, 18 frames per second. And it should be being played back at 18 frames per second. But the modern camera systems only play back at 24. And you end up with this acceleration of the frames. So when you watch these older films, you have to kind of make a judgment call. Some of them aren't supposed to look silly. Some of them are supposed to look normal. But it's a consequence of frame rates. Now, to dive in a little bit deeper here, let's give this a wind. Frame rate controls are a very big part of the creative sort of possibilities with the camera. If I want to do slow motion, it's pretty straightforward. I can turn this camera up to 64 frames per second. So if I push the button, listen. So you can imagine like I'm shooting tons and tons of images. Now if I take that exact same film and I put it in a projector in a movie theater and I play it back at 24 frames per second, it's going to take you about 3 times as long to cover those images. In other words, it's going to slow time down roughly 3 times, right? So you get slow motion. So to shoot slow motion, you have to capture a lot of frames per second. And then when it's played back at regular speed, time is slowed down, right? If you flip that over, time-lapse videos and films, which speed time up considerably, are shot the opposite way. In other words, you just take one frame, that's one frame, you wait, another frame, you wait. So you can imagine if you're going to point a camera at a flower and you want to see the flower bloom, it's pretty simple. All you have to do is you take one frame and it just sits there for a whole minute, right? It doesn't take any more frames. And then a minute goes by and maybe the flower moves a millimeter. It takes the next frame. So in 24 frames, you'd be covering 24 minutes of real motion, right? And that's how time-lapse videos are created. So frame rate controls give you a pretty diverse sort of palette of possibilities with manipulating time. Again, slow motion is created by shooting more frames per second than you play back. Fast motion or time lapse is created by shooting fewer frames per second than you play back. In other words, if you are playing back more frames per second than what you shot, it's going to be accelerated. If you're playing back fewer frames per second than what the camera captured, it's going to be slow motion. Okay? So just think about that and digest it. You have to answer some questions on that. Okay? Okay, you guys enjoy the film? Do the questions down there. There's a bunch of them this week, so look at the notes carefully, listen to the video carefully if you missed anything. Next week we do Chaplin. The week after that, that's it, is the final. Okay, so we're coming to the end, finish strong. Enjoy the film, this one's awesome.